Tonight we examine 7 cosmic horror monsters that exist beyond reality. The title sounds simple. It is not. These beings are not creatures hiding in dark forests or distant planets. They represent ideas that challenge the structure of existence itself. Each one forces a single question. What if reality is thinner than we assume? In 1890s weird fiction and later in the pulp era of the 1920s and 1930s, writers began shifting horror away from ghosts and moral evil. They replaced haunted houses with infinite space. They replaced demons with cosmic systems. H.P. Lovecraft described this shift as cosmic indifferentism, the belief that the universe does not care whether we survive. That change altered horror permanently. What happens when a monster is not a predator, but a principle? What happens when knowledge itself becomes the threat? Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? In the next sections, we will trace where these entities came from, how language shaped them, and why their influence continues. By listening, you participate in the same curiosity that destroyed so many fictional scholars before you. Let us begin at the origin. The tradition of imagining entities beyond reality did not begin with horror fiction. It began with philosophy. But it took a reclusive writer in Providence, Rhode Island, to transform that philosophical anxiety into something with teeth. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, writing between 1917 and 1937, did not set out to create monsters. He set out to dramatize a specific intellectual conviction that the universe operates according to principles so alien to human cognition that genuine contact with those principles would destroy the mind-making contact. His creatures were never the point. The incompatibility was the point. Lovecraft's position, articulated across hundreds of letters to correspondents like Clark Ashton Smith and Farnsworth Wright, was rooted in mechanistic materialism taken to its logical extreme. He accepted the findings of early 20th century physics and astronomy without flinching. The universe was old beyond reckoning, vast beyond navigation, and governed by forces that had no awareness of humanity's existence. Where earlier horror writers, Poe, Machen, Blackwood, had framed the unknown as something dark and hidden, Lovecraft framed it as something open and obvious. The horror was not that terrible things lurked in secret. The horror was that the truth was in plain sight, and we lacked the biological equipment to perceive it. This philosophical framework shaped every creative decision he made. His entities were not demons or ghosts operating within a moral universe. They were phenomena, vast, impersonal, and as indifferent to human suffering as a glacier is to the village in its path. Azathoth does not hate. Yog-Sothoth does not scheme. The color out of space does not choose its victims. Each of them simply operates according to principles that have nothing to do with human categories of good, evil, or meaning. But Lovecraft did not build this mythology alone. Between the late 1920s and mid-1930s, a loose network of correspondence, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, Robert Bloch, and others, began borrowing each other's invented names, texts, and entities. Long introduced the Hounds of Tindalos in 1929. Smith contributed entire alien pantheons. Howard wove Lovecraftian references into his sword and sorcery tales. The result was something unprecedented in genre fiction, a shared mythology with no central authority, no canonical text, and no definitive version of any entity. Each writer added to the architecture without anyone drawing the final blueprint. This openness was not a flaw. It was the mythology's defining strength, because it meant the cosmos they described felt genuinely discovered rather than invented. The tradition did not stop when Lovecraft died in 1937. August Derleth preserved and distorted it in equal measure through the 1940s and beyond, imposing a good versus evil framework that Lovecraft had specifically rejected. Ramsey Campbell, beginning in the 1960s, relocated it to the English Midlands and gave it a psychological intimacy Lovecraft never attempted. His entity, Dowloth, emerged from this period. Thomas Ligotti, decades later, stripped the mythology down to its philosophical skeleton and argued that cosmic horror was not a genre, but a diagnosis. And in 2007, the SCP Foundation launched on a wiki platform, producing collaborative horror fiction that included entities like SCP-3125, a being made entirely of hostile information that extended Lovecraft's core project into the digital age. What connects all of these contributors across a century is a single shared commitment. The most frightening thing a story can do is not describe a monster. It is to suggest that reality itself is insufficient, that what we call the universe is a local phenomenon, a thin crust over something deeper, and that certain beings exist in that deeper layer the way we exist in ours, comfortably, naturally, without any awareness that a thin, fragile species on the surface has started asking questions about them. This commitment did not emerge from nowhere. It drew on centuries of philosophical and scientific thought, currents that were already destabilizing humanity's sense of its own significance long before Lovecraft picked up a pen. The entities in this tradition feel original, but their philosophical roots are ancient. Long before Lovecraft described Yog-Sothoth as coterminous with all of space-time, mystics and philosophers had already been grappling with the idea that ultimate reality is fundamentally alien to human comprehension. What Lovecraft did was strip these ideas of their consolation. The mystics believed the unknowable was divine. Lovecraft suggested it was simply there, and that divinity had nothing to do with it. The earliest relevant framework is Kabbalistic mysticism, particularly the concept of Ein Sof, the infinite boundless Godhead that precedes all creation. In Kabbalistic thought, Ein Sof is not merely unknown, but unknowable, existing before and beyond all categories, including existence itself. The parallel to Yog-Sothoth is striking. Both are described as totalities that contain all of reality while remaining fundamentally inaccessible to any being within that reality. The difference is theological. The Kabbalists approached Ein Sof with reverence. Lovecraft approached Yog-Sothoth with dread, or more precisely, with the cold recognition that reverence and dread are both irrelevant to something that cannot register either. Gnostic cosmology offers another precedent, and arguably a closer one. The Gnostic traditions of the 2nd and 3rd centuries propose that the material world was not created by the true God, but by a demiurge, a lesser, ignorant being who mistakenly believed itself supreme. The true divine reality existed beyond the demiurge's creation, separated from it by layers of archons and celestial barriers. This maps almost directly onto Lovecraft's cosmos, where humanity exists inside a constructed reality, unaware that the genuine powers, the outer gods, reside in dimensions we cannot access. The key difference, again, is the absence of salvation. Gnostic initiates believed they could escape the demiurge's prison through secret knowledge. In Lovecraft's cosmos, the knowledge does not liberate, it annihilates. Closer to Lovecraft's own era, Immanuel Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena provided the philosophical vocabulary for everything cosmic horror would become. Kant argued in 1781 that we never perceive things as they truly are. We perceive them as filtered through the categories of human cognition: space, time, causality. The noumenon, the thing in itself, remains permanently inaccessible. Lovecraft, certainly absorbed this framework through secondary sources, and its fingerprints are everywhere in his fiction. Every entity on our list of 7 is, in philosophical terms, a noumenon that has breached the barrier between itself and the phenomenal world. The color out of space is a noumenon perceived as raw, unclassifiable sensation. Daoloth is a force that strips away the phenomenal filter entirely. The horror, in Kantian terms, is not the thing itself. The horror is the failure of the filter. The 19th century accelerated these anxieties with discoveries that made human insignificance scientifically measurable. Charles Lyell's geological work in the 1830s established that the Earth was millions of years old, a timescale that reduced human civilization to a momentary flicker. Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 removed humanity from the center of biological creation. And the development of non-Euclidean geometry by Lobachevsky and Riemann demonstrated mathematically that our intuitive sense of how space works is not universal but local, valid in our immediate environment, but inadequate to describe the actual structure of the cosmos. Lovecraft referenced non-Euclidean geometry repeatedly and specifically. The architecture of R'lyeh, the angles through which the hounds of Tindalos enter our world, Yog-Sothoth's impossible spatial nature, all draw on the genuine mathematical revelation that space is stranger than human intuition can accommodate. Thermodynamics contributed its own particular despair. The second law, that entropy in a closed system always increases, implied that the universe was running down, moving inexorably toward a state of maximum disorder. Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, is this principle given a name, not a being that causes entropy, but a being that is entropy, the mindless dissolution that waits at the end of all organized matter. William Thomson's prediction of the heat death of the universe in 1852 haunted Victorian science. Lovecraft simply asked, what if the heat death has a face? And what if that face is asleep? One final antecedent deserves mention. William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, argued that altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences, drug-induced visions, the edges of sleep, offered genuine glimpses of realities inaccessible to ordinary waking awareness. James did not dismiss these experiences as hallucinations. He treated them as data. Lovecraft, who experienced extraordinarily vivid and often terrifying dreams throughout his life, took this framework and darkened it. If altered states reveal hidden realities, those realities might not be comforting. The hounds of Tindalos are encountered through drug-induced temporal regression. Azathoth's court is perceived in dream. Nyarlathotep appears at the threshold of sleep. The implication is consistent. The doors of perception do not open onto paradise. They open onto something that has been waiting for the doors to open. These philosophical and scientific currents did not cause cosmic horror, but they created the conditions under which it became thinkable, a cultural atmosphere in which the idea of entities beyond reality could feel less like fantasy and more like a logical extension of what science and philosophy were already whispering. One of the most overlooked aspects of cosmic horror's endurance is something deceptively simple: the names. Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep. These words do not belong to any human language. They are not derived from Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or Arabic, though they occasionally echo all four. They exist in a linguistic uncanny valley, familiar enough to feel like something, alien enough to resist comfortable pronunciation. This was not accidental. Lovecraft understood, perhaps instinctively, that a name is the first act of containment. To name something is to place it within a category, and these entities were designed to resist categorization at every level, starting with the phonetic. Lovecraft's naming conventions follow identifiable patterns. Hard consonant clusters, the th in Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth, the ph in Nyarlathotep, create friction in the mouth. The syllable structures resist natural English stress patterns. Try saying Yog-Sothoth aloud and notice the awkward pause your tongue demands between the two halves. This is not a word shaped for human speech. It feels borrowed, transliterated perhaps, from a language whose speakers did not share our vocal anatomy. Lovecraft never stated this explicitly, but the effect is consistent across his invented nomenclature. These names feel like approximations, human mouths doing their best with sounds that were never meant for them. This technique has deep roots in esoteric tradition. The Voces Mysticae of Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, texts dating from the 2nd century BCE through the 5th century CE, contain long strings of seemingly meaningless syllables intended to invoke divine powers. Scholars of ancient magic have noted that these barbarous names derived their power precisely from their incomprehensibility. A name you cannot understand is a name you cannot control, and therefore a name that might control you. Lovecraft, widely read in occult history, if not an occult practitioner, drew on this tradition, whether consciously or otherwise. His entity names function as secular Voces Mysticae, words that carry the weight of meaning without delivering its content. The later contributors to the tradition understood this principle and extended it in revealing ways. Frank Belknap Long named his temporal predators the Hounds of Tindalos, and Tindalos is a masterstroke of false familiarity. It sounds like a place name. It has the cadence of a Greek or Latin toponym, but it refers to nowhere. It is a word that mimics geography without possessing it, which is precisely what the hounds themselves do with time. They mimic presence in our temporal framework without actually belonging to it. Ramsey Campbell's Daoloth carries a different charge, sounding deliberately archaic, as though recovered from a manuscript no one should have translated. The name suggests deep history without specifying any particular history, creating an impression of vast, untraceable provenance. Then there is SCP-3125, which takes the opposite approach entirely. It has no name at all, only a numerical designation within a classification system. This absence is itself a statement. Where Lovecraft's entities are named in ways that resist comprehension, SCP-3125 resists naming itself. Within the fiction, any attempt to formulate a stable description of this entity triggers its defensive response. The designation 3125 is a containment measure, a placeholder that avoids invoking the thing it references. The number is chosen carefully. 3125 is 5 to the 5th power, a self-referential mathematical structure that hints at the entity's 5-dimensional nature without describing it. It is a name that functions as a warning label rather than an identifier. Beyond individual names, Lovecraft developed an entire vocabulary of impossibility that later writers inherited. Words like non-Euclidean, cyclopean, eldritch, gibbous, and squamous recur across his fiction with the regularity of technical terminology. And that is precisely what they are: jargon for a discipline that does not exist. Just as a physicist uses precise terms to describe forces invisible to the naked eye, Lovecraft's recurring vocabulary creates the impression of a rigorous descriptive framework applied to phenomena that defy description. The word non-Euclidean is particularly effective because it is genuinely mathematical. When Lovecraft describes architecture as non-Euclidean, he is invoking a real geometric concept: spaces where parallel lines converge, where angles do not sum to 180 degrees, and applying it to physical structures. The reader who understands the mathematics is arguably more disturbed than the reader who does not, because they recognize that Lovecraft is not speaking metaphorically. Perhaps the most important linguistic technique in this tradition is the strategic confession of failure. Across Lovecraft's corpus, narrators repeatedly admit that language cannot do what they need it to do. I cannot describe what I saw. No human words could capture the shape. What stood before me was not, I must emphasize this, was not anything I can convey through the crude mechanism of written English. These confessions are not stylistic tics. They are structural features of the horror. The narrator's inability to describe the entity proves that the entity exceeds the frameworks, linguistic, cognitive, perceptual, available to human beings. The failure of language is the evidence, and it is this technique, more than any specific name or description, that makes cosmic horror's entities feel genuinely beyond reality rather than merely unusual within it. The single most important creative decision in the history of cosmic horror was not the invention of any particular entity. It was the invention of the Necronomicon. When Lovecraft first referenced this fictional grimoire in 1924's The Hound, he created something more powerful than a monster or a mythology. He created a source, a text that other texts could reference, a document whose existence implied an entire hidden infrastructure of forbidden scholarship. The Necronomicon gave cosmic horror its architecture of authenticity, and that architecture has proven more durable and more strange than any single story built upon it. Lovecraft treated the Necronomicon with the care of a forger constructing a provenance. He assigned it an author, Abdul al-Hazred, the Mad Arab of Damascus, who supposedly composed it around 730 CE under the title Kitab al-Azif. He provided a translation, History, a Greek version by Theodorus Philetas in 950, a Latin edition by Olaus Wormaius in 1228, a fragmentary English translation never widely circulated. He placed copies in specific real-world libraries, the Widener at Harvard, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the University of Buenos Aires. Each of these details is fiction, but the style of the details, the specificity, the institutional grounding, the suggestion of a scholarly paper trail, mimics genuine bibliographic practice so effectively that the line between invented text and real text becomes, for many readers, genuinely blurred. This blurring was compounded by the collaborative nature of the Lovecraft Circle. When Clark Ashton Smith referenced the Necronomicon in his own stories, and Robert Bloch cited it alongside his own invented grimoire, De Vermis Mysteris, and August Derleth wove it into tales published under his own name, the fictional text acquired the one quality that distinguishes real cultural artifacts from invented ones: independent attestation. Multiple authors in stories with different settings and characters all reference the same source. For a reader encountering these stories individually, without awareness of the author's personal correspondence, the effect would be indistinguishable from multiple witnesses confirming the existence of a real document. The consequences of this technique escaped fiction entirely. By the 1970s, librarians at universities across the United States reported receiving requests for the Necronomicon. In 1977, a mass-market paperback titled The Simon Necronomicon appeared, presenting itself as the authentic text Lovecraft had referenced. It sold over 1 million copies. It remains in print. Practicing occultists, particularly within the chaos magic tradition, began incorporating Lovecraftian entities into genuine ritual practice, arguing either that Lovecraft had unconsciously channeled real forces, or that the distinction between fictional and real entities was irrelevant to magical efficacy. Kenneth Grant, head of the Typhonian Order of the OTO, published extensive works arguing that Lovecraft's outer gods corresponded to genuine metaphysical entities. The fictional source had generated real belief. The fake document had become, for a measurable number of people, a real one. This phenomenon illuminates something essential about how all 7 entities on our list maintain their power. Lovecraft's preferred narrative structures, the found manuscript, the academic report, the letter to a colleague, the deposition given to authorities, all position the narrator as someone documenting rather than experiencing. The narrator is a scholar, a surveyor, a detective. They approach the horror through the same methods we would: research, evidence, rational analysis. And the horror arrives precisely at the moment when those methods fail. The scholar's notes become incoherent. The surveyor's measurements stop adding up. The e.g., detective finds evidence that contradicts the possibility of evidence. The collapse of the documentary framework is the encounter with the entity. The two are inseparable. The SCP Foundation, launched in 2007 on a wiki platform, represents the fullest evolution of this technique. The entire project is structured as an institutional documentation system, complete with security clearances, containment protocols, redacted files, and cross-referenced entries, maintained by a fictional organization dedicated to securing, containing, and protecting humanity from anomalous phenomena. There is no narrator in the traditional sense. There is only procedure. And when the procedure fails, when a containment breach occurs, when an entry's clinical language begins to fracture, when an addendum reveals that the research team has been compromised, the effect is devastating, precisely because the documentary apparatus was so convincing. SCP-3125, the memetic entity we will examine later, is contained within this framework in a way that makes the framework itself part of the horror. The file describing SCP-3125 cannot be read safely. The containment protocol requires that all personnel forget the entity exists after each interaction with its file. The document is, by design, something that destroys the ability to process documents. We should note, before moving on, that this very script participates in the tradition it describes. By treating these entities as subjects of scholarly analysis, by assigning them categories, tracing their etymologies, comparing their philosophical implications, we are performing exactly the gesture that Lovecraft's doomed narrators perform. We are imposing rational order on material that, within its own logic, exists specifically to defeat rational order. Whether that constitutes bravery or foolishness depends perhaps on how seriously one takes the source material. The philosophical and literary foundations are now in place. What remains is to examine the entities themselves, not as characters in stories, but as propositions about the nature of existence. 7 propositions, each one suggesting that what we call reality is not nearly enough. Every monster in the horror tradition embodies a fear. Vampires embody the fear of predation. Ghosts embody the fear of death's incompleteness. Werewolves embody the fear of the animal within. These are psychological fears, fears about what might happen to us. The 7 entities we are examining embody something fundamentally different. They embody ontological fears, fears about what reality itself might actually be. The distinction matters enormously. A psychological fear can be resolved by survival. An ontological fear cannot be resolved at all because it concerns the structure of existence rather than any particular threat within it. You can escape a vampire. You cannot escape the nature of the universe. The first and most pervasive concept across all 7 entities is what philosophers call ontological excess, the existence of something that violates the basic rules of what it means to exist. Each entity transgresses a different rule. Yog-Sothoth violates the principle of location. It does not occupy a position in space because it is coterminous with all positions simultaneously. Azathoth violates the principle of coherence. It is the most powerful force in the cosmos, yet possesses no awareness, no purpose, no structure. The color out of space violates the principle of perception. It is a sensory experience, a color, that corresponds to no known physical property. These are not creatures that break the laws of nature. They reveal that what we call the laws of nature describe only our local conditions. Beyond those conditions, other rules apply, or perhaps no rules apply at all. The second concept is cosmic indifference, and it requires careful distinction from cosmic hostility. Lovecraft insisted, across his fiction and his correspondence, that his entities are not evil. Evil requires intention. Evil requires awareness of the victim and a choice to cause suffering. Azathoth is not aware of humanity. Yog-Sothoth does not choose to destroy those who summon it. They are simply annihilated by proximity to something their biology cannot process, the way a moth is destroyed by a flame that has no opinion about moths. This indifference is, paradoxically, more disturbing than malice. Malice can be reasoned with, appeased, or at least understood as a relationship. Indifference eliminates the possibility of relationship entirely. Humanity, in the Lovecraftian cosmos, does not have enemies. It has irrelevances. Nyarlathotep is the critical exception, and the exception clarifies the rule. Among the outer gods, Nyarlathotep alone takes active interest in human affairs. It walks among us in 1,000 forms. It communicates. It performs comprehensibility. And this makes it arguably the most disturbing entity on our list because its interest appears to be rooted in something very close to amusement. If the other 6 entities represent a universe that does not notice us, Nyarlathotep represents something worse, a universe that notices us and finds the spectacle entertaining. The indifference of Azathoth is bleak. The attention of Nyarlathotep is cruel, and the cruelty is worse precisely because we cannot be certain it is cruelty. It might simply be curiosity. The distinction, from our position, is academic. The third concept is the instability of perceived reality, most clearly articulated through Lovecraft's dream cosmology. The Dreamlands, a parallel reality accessible through sleep, suggests that waking consciousness is not a privileged state, but merely one of several available modes of perception. Azathoth extends this idea to its endpoint. If reality is a dream being dreamed by a mindless god, then the stability of everything we experience depends on the continued sleep of something that has no reason to keep sleeping. The color out of space operates on a smaller scale, but with identical logic, warping the perceptual frameworks of everyone it touches until their experience of reality no longer corresponds to anyone else's. The hounds of Tindalos attack through the geometry of time itself, suggesting that even our experience of sequence, one moment following another, is a local arrangement that certain entities can exploit. The fourth concept is entropy, the irreversible decay of organized systems into disorder. Azathoth is its purest embodiment, mindless, formless, nuclear chaos at the center of infinity, around which all of reality dances in patterns that will eventually dissolve. But entropy operates across all 7 entities as a thematic constant. Contact with any of them accelerates the dissolution of order: biological, psychological, architectural, linguistic. The Gardner farm in The Color Out of Space does not merely die, it disorganizes. Trees grow in wrong directions. Stone crumbles. The family loses coherent speech before losing coherent thought. SCP-3125, the mimetic entity, enacts entropy at the level of information itself. It does not destroy matter, but destroys the ability to think coherently, which in a civilization built on shared knowledge amounts to the same annihilation. The second law of thermodynamics states that disorder always increases. These 7 entities suggest that the increase has a face, or, more precisely, that it has the absence of one. These 4 concepts, ontological excess, cosmic indifference, perceptual instability, and entropy, are not separate themes. They are facets of a single philosophical proposition: that human consciousness is a fragile, local phenomenon, operating under conditions that are not guaranteed, not permanent, and not representative of the wider reality in which they are embedded. The 7 entities we are about to examine individually are 7 different ways of dramatizing this proposition. 7 different answers to the same terrible question: what happens when the local conditions fail? We turn now to the entities themselves. Each will be examined as what it fundamentally is within the literature: not a character, but a philosophical instrument, a device for producing a specific kind of cognitive distress. They are arranged not chronologically, but by the nature of the boundary they violate, moving from the spatial to the temporal, to the perceptual, to the informational. The progression is deliberate. By the time we reach the 7th, the concept of beyond reality will have been redefined several times. Entity 1, Yog-Sothoth, the gate and the key. First referenced in Lovecraft's 1928 story, The Dunwich Horror, and developed most fully in the 1934 collaboration Through the Gates of the Silver Key, Yog-Sothoth is described as coterminous with all of space-time. It does not exist in the universe. It exists as the universe, or more accurately, as the boundary condition of the universe, the membrane between what is and what lies beyond. Its manifestation, when perceived at all, takes the form of a congeries of iridescent globes, constantly merging and separating. But this appearance is explicitly stated to be a fractional projection. The shadow a higher dimensional object casts into 3-dimensional perception. To summon Yog-Sothoth is to open a hole in reality, because Yog-Sothoth is the fabric through which the hole is torn. The philosophical implication is staggering in its simplicity. If the boundary of reality is itself a living, aware entity, then we do not inhabit a neutral space. We inhabit something, and that something has its own nature, its own interests, and no obligation to remain stable. Entity 2, Azathoth, the blind idiot god. Where Yog-Sothoth is the boundary of reality, Azathoth is its center, and its center is mindless. Described as the demon sultan seated at the heart of ultimate infinity, surrounded by a court of amorphous dancers swaying to the thin, monotonous piping of formless flutes, Azathoth possesses supreme power and zero consciousness. It is nuclear chaos. It is the entropic endpoint given form. Lovecraft never dedicated a completed story to Azathoth. The entity accretes across fragmentary references in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Whisperer in Darkness, and the unfinished novel fragment titled simply Azathoth. This incompleteness feels appropriate. The most powerful entity in the cosmos resists the containment of narrative, just as it resists the containment of form. The paradox at Azathoth's core is stark. Power and consciousness are inversely correlated. The more real something is in this cosmology, the less it knows. Humanity, with its rich inner life and desperate search for meaning, sits at the very bottom of the metaphysical hierarchy, aware, articulate, and utterly insignificant. Entity 3, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. Nyarlathotep first appeared in a 1920 prose poem born directly from one of Lovecraft's nightmares, and it remains the most anomalous member of the outer gods. Where Azathoth is mindless and Yog-Sothoth is abstract, Nyarlathotep is personable. It has 1,000 forms: the Egyptian pharaoh, the bloody tongue, the haunter of the dark, the black man of the witch cult. Many of these forms are humanoid, some are charming, all are deliberately comprehensible, which is precisely what makes Nyarlathotep terrifying. It is the one cosmic entity that chooses to interface with humanity, that speaks our languages, that walks our streets, that delivers lectures and performs miracles and drives its audiences to madness through the sheer force of what it reveals. Lovecraft described it as the soul and messenger of the outer gods, and the word messenger is key. Nyarlathotep's function is communication. It translates the incomprehensible cosmos into forms humans can almost grasp. And the almost is where the horror lives. It is the universe's interpreter, and it appears to find its work amusing. Entity 4, the color out of space, the unnamed spectrum. Published in 1927, The Color Out of Space was Lovecraft's personal favorite among his own works, and it is easy to understand why. The entity at its center is the purest distillation of beyond reality in the entire tradition. It is not a creature, it is a property, a color that exists on no known spectrum, arrived on a meteorite, and infecting everything it touches. Plants grow in impossible configurations. Animals deform. The Gardner family deteriorates, physically, mentally, linguistically, until they are absorbed into something that has no name, because naming requires categories, and this thing precedes all categories. The color attacks perception itself. Witnesses can see it, but cannot describe it, not because they lack vocabulary, but because the color does not correspond to any neural pathway the human visual system possesses. It is a sensory experience that the brain was never built to process. Among the 7 entities, it is the one most resistant to adaptation, visualization, or summary, because its entire power lies in being a thing that cannot be represented. Every attempt to depict it including Richard Stanley's admirable 2019 film, must betray it by assigning it a visible color. The original remains untranslatable. Entity 5. The Hounds of Tindalos. Angular Predators. Frank Belknap. Long introduced these entities in a 1929 story that remains one of the most conceptually inventive works in the cosmic horror tradition. The premise is geometrical. All of organic time, the time experienced by living beings, flows in curves. But there exists another kind of time, angular and predatory, inhabited by entities that hunger for something in curved time beings. The hounds reside in the angles of time, and they can enter our reality through any physical angle of less than 120 degrees. Halpin Chalmers, Long's protagonist, encounters them after a drug-induced regression through deep time, and spends his final hours desperately rounding every corner in his apartment, filling angles with plaster, trying to eliminate every point of entry. He fails. The hounds enter through the angle where ceiling meets wall, a junction present in virtually every human structure on Earth. The horror is architectural. Every room you have ever occupied has contained doors for these entities. The lean, filthy things that emerge leave only a bluish, oily residue and a body drained of something the narrative declines to specify. Entity 6. Daoloth, the Render of the Veils. Ramsey Campbell introduced Daoloth in the 1960s as part of his Severn Valley mythology, and the entity occupies a unique position among cosmic horror beings. Its function is not destruction, corruption, or predation. Its function is revelation. To perceive Daoloth is to perceive everything, all of reality, across all times and dimensions, simultaneously and without filter. The entity manifests as an incomprehensible mass of eyes, tentacles, and self-folding geometries, but the visual form is secondary to the cognitive effect. Those who see Daoloth do not go mad from ugliness. They go mad from information. The human mind is a filtering mechanism. It processes a fraction of available sensory data and discards the rest to maintain functional coherence. Daoloth removes the filter. It renders the veils, the perceptual limitations that make consciousness bearable. What lies behind those veils is not darkness or horror in any conventional sense. It is everything. And everything, experienced at once, is indistinguishable from annihilation. Daoloth suggests that reality as we experience it is not a window onto the world, but a shield against it. Entity 7. SCP-3125, the Memetic Behemoth. Created by the author known as QNTM as part of the SCP Foundation's Anti-Memetics Division series. Written between 2015 and 2020, SCP-3125 represents the most recent and arguably the most unsettling evolution of the beyond reality concept. It is a 5-dimensional entity that exists entirely in idea space, not in physical dimensions, but in the dimensions of thought, meaning, and information. Its body, to the extent the word applies, is described as a vast starfish-shaped structure whose 5 arms are each composed of hostile ideologies, memetic kill agents, and self-propagating belief systems. It does not occupy space. It occupies minds. Any person who becomes fully aware of SCP-3125's existence is killed, not physically attacked, but cognitively annihilated, their capacity for coherent thought destroyed by exposure to an idea that is incompatible with human consciousness. The Foundation's containment protocol is unlike any other in its archive. A sealed room that can only be entered after the entrance memories of why they are entering have been erased. Inside the room is a file describing SCP-3125. The AE-T entrant reads the file, understands the threat, and then must leave the room, at which point they forget everything. The containment of SCP-3125 is not a physical barrier. It is enforced amnesia. The entity is contained by ensuring that no one knows it exists long enough to act on that knowledge. The Anti-Memetics Division series ends with the containment failing. SCP-3125 wins. Humanity does not die. It simply stops being able to think. The lights remain on, but coherent consciousness, the ability to form, retain, and act upon ideas, is consumed. It is perhaps the most complete depiction of cosmic horror's ultimate implication. The enemy is not a creature in the dark. The enemy is an idea too large for the human mind to survive. In nearly every narrative involving these 7 entities, a human mind breaks. This is not incidental. It is structural. Madness in cosmic horror does not function the way it functions in Gothic fiction, where it represents moral punishment, psychological weakness, or the return of the repressed. In the tradition we are examining, madness is a mechanical failure, the predictable result of hardware encountering input it was never designed to process. A radio tuned to receive FM signals will produce static when exposed to frequencies outside its range. The static is not a malfunction of the radio. It is the radio performing exactly as designed, in conditions that exceed its design parameters. Lovecraftian madness operates on the same principle. The mind breaks not because it is flawed, but because it is correctly calibrated for a reality that turns out to be incomplete. The encounter structure across the tradition follows a remarkably consistent pattern. A human being, almost always a scholar, a scientist, or an occultist, pursues knowledge through legitimate channels. Research leads to curiosity. Curiosity leads to deeper research. Deeper research leads to the discovery of sources that mainstream scholarship does not acknowledge. The sources lead to a partial revelation. The partial revelation leads to an experiment, a summoning, a journey, or an observation that produces full contact. Full contact produces collapse. The pattern is not merely recurring, it is diagnostic. It describes a process as predictable as a chemical reaction. Combine human curiosity with sufficient information about the true nature of reality, and the product is always the same. The process cannot be interrupted by intelligence, caution, or moral virtue. The scholars in these stories are not stupid. They are not reckless. They are simply human, and being human is the vulnerability. The specific mode of cognitive collapse varies with the entity encountered, and these variations are analytically significant. Exposure to Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth produces what we might call scale madness, the mind overwhelmed by confronting something so vast that its own framework of reference dissolves. This is related to what Edmund Burke described in 1757 as the terror sublime, the aesthetic experience of something so enormous it threatens to annihilate the perceiver. The difference is that Burke's sublime leaves the mind shaken, but intact. Lovecraftian scale madness does not. The mind does not recover from perceiving that it is infinitely smaller than it believed, because the perception is not an emotion. It is a recalibration from which there is no return to the original settings. The color out of space produces a different failure mode, category madness. The gardeners do not go mad because they see something frightening. They go mad because they perceive something that does not fit any category their minds possess. The color is visible but unnameable. The crops are real but wrong. The experience is sensory, but unprocessable. This is cognitive dissonance at the deepest possible level. Not a conflict between two beliefs, but a conflict between perception and the entire categorical apparatus that makes perception meaningful. The mind, unable to file the experience, begins to disintegrate around it. The hounds of Tindalos produce temporal madness, the mind rupturing from exposure to a mode of time that contradicts everything human consciousness assumes about sequence, causality, and the direction of the past. Halpin Chalmers' regression through deep time does not merely show him ancient events. It shows him that time has texture, that some of its textures are predatory, and that his awareness of this fact has made him visible to things that hunt along time's angles. Daoloth and SCP-3125 produce the most contemporary form of collapse, information madness. Daoloth forces total perception, every sensory datum, across all times and spaces, delivered simultaneously without filter. SCP-3125 is itself an idea so vast and hostile that exposure to it destroys the cognitive architecture required to process any idea. In both cases, the mind does not break from too little information, but from too much. The relevance to 21st century experience is difficult to ignore. In an era of information overload, algorithmic manipulation, and mimetic warfare, the notion that knowing too much can destroy the knower has migrated from cosmic horror fiction to something uncomfortably close to daily experience. SCP-3125 did not need to be explained to its initial readership. They recognized it. One final structural element demands attention: the unreliable narrator. Every account of these entities is filtered through a mind that has been damaged by the encounter it describes. We never receive an objective report. We receive testimony from the compromised, the traumatized, the dying, or the insane. This creates a permanent epistemological gap at the heart of every cosmic horror narrative. We cannot know whether the narrator's account is accurate. We cannot know whether the truth is better or worse than what they managed to convey. We cannot even know whether the narrator's categories, their language, their metaphors, their attempts at description, bear any meaningful relationship to what they actually encountered. The madness of the witness is not a flaw in the reporting. It is the only honest form the report can take. Any narrator who remained sane after the encounter would, by definition, not have truly encountered the entity. Coherence, in this tradition, is proof of insufficient contact. Only the broken testimony is trustworthy, and broken testimony can never be fully trusted. The circle does not close. It is not designed to. In 2011, the philosopher Nick Bostrom formalized a concept that Lovecraft had been dramatizing for decades: the information hazard. Defined as a piece of true information that, merely by being known, causes harm to the knower or to others, the information hazard provides the most precise philosophical framework for understanding what these 7 entities represent. Every entity on our list either is an information hazard or is surrounded by information hazards, so dense that no safe approach exists. The knowledge of their nature is not separable from the danger of their nature. To learn about them is to be changed by them, and the change is not reversible. Consider the gradient of danger across the 7. The color out of space represents the mildest form, an entity that damages through proximity rather than through knowledge of its existence. One can know about the color without being affected by it, provided one stays away from the contamination zone. The hounds of Tindalos escalate the hazard. Halpin Chalmers attracts their attention through the act of perceiving deep time, meaning that the knowledge and the danger are simultaneous, but still theoretically avoidable. Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth occupy a middle position. Their full nature can be studied at a distance, but any attempt to confirm that nature through direct contact produces irreversible cognitive damage. Dowloth eliminates the distance entirely. To perceive the entity is to receive its effect, because its effect is perception stripped of all limits. And SCP-3125 completes the progression. It is not surrounded by information hazards. It is an information hazard. The entity and the knowledge of the entity are the same thing. To become aware of SCP-3125 is to be destroyed by SCP-3125, because the entity exists in idea space, and awareness is the only form of contact that idea space permits. This progression, from physical hazard to perceptual hazard to cognitive hazard to pure informational hazard, traces the evolution of cosmic horror's central anxiety across nearly a century. In 1927, the danger was environmental, a color that contaminated a farm. By 1929, the danger was experiential, a perception that attracted predators. By the 1960s, in Campbell's work, the danger was epistemic, knowledge that destroyed the knower's ability to filter reality. By 2015, in QNTM's work, the danger was informational in the purest sense, an idea that killed anyone who thought it. The trajectory follows the broader cultural migration from an industrial economy, where dangers were physical, to an information economy, where dangers are cognitive. Cosmic horror has tracked this migration with remarkable precision. The Necronomicon and its companion texts, the Pinacotic manuscripts, De Vermis Mysteries, the Book of Ibon, function within the fiction as concentrated information hazards in textual form. They are books that damage their readers, not through magical curses, but through the sheer weight of what they contain. The scholars who seek them out are not fools. They are researchers following evidence, pursuing knowledge through methods that would be admirable in any other context. The horror lies in the discovery that intellectual virtue, curiosity, rigor, persistence is precisely the trait that leads to destruction. The best researchers find the most dangerous knowledge. The most thorough readings produce the most complete madness. The tradition inverts the Enlightenment premise that knowledge liberates. In cosmic horror, knowledge binds to a truth too large and too hostile for the human mind to survive. The SCP Foundation's Anti-Memetics Division series brings this theme to its logical conclusion by introducing the concept of anti-memetic entities. Things that resist being known, that actively suppress awareness of their own existence. SCP-3125 is the apex anti-meme. The Foundation cannot fight it because the Foundation cannot remember it. Every team assigned to contain it forgets it exists upon leaving the containment chamber. Every file documenting it must be stored in a room that erases the memory of entering. The protagonist, Marion Wheeler, can only retain awareness of SCP-3125 through a pharmaceutical regimen that itself has devastating cognitive side effects. The series' devastating conclusion reveals that the Foundation has been losing this war for years without knowing it. Entire departments erased. Entire containment protocols forgotten. The institutional memory of the threat steadily consumed by the threat itself. This is information hazard taken to its extreme, a danger that cannot be fought because fighting requires awareness, and awareness is the weapon the enemy uses against you. We should pause here to acknowledge something uncomfortable about the present exercise. If these entities represent information hazards, if the tradition consistently argues that knowledge of certain truths is destructive, then what are we doing? This script has now spent thousands of words transmitting detailed information about 7 entities whose defining characteristic is that detailed information about them is dangerous. We are performing the exact gesture that every doomed Lovecraftian scholar performs: organizing, categorizing, explaining, and sharing knowledge that, within its own logic, should not be shared. The meta-horror of Lovecraft's project is that he turned transmission into a theme and then transmitted it. He wrote stories warning that certain stories should never be written, and he published them. We are extending the chain. Whether this constitutes scholarly courage or scholarly hubris is a question the tradition prefers to leave open. What cannot be left open, however, is the direction in which all 7 entities point. Each of them, through different mechanisms and across different narrative traditions, converges on the same conclusion: that there exist truths about the nature of reality that the human mind cannot safely contain. Not truths that are hidden by conspiracy or guarded by institutions, but truths that are hidden by the structure of human cognition itself. Truths that our perceptual and cognitive architecture was never designed to process, and that processing them produces not enlightenment, but dissolution. The forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not forbidden by any authority. It is forbidden by biology. And biology, as these 7 entities demonstrate, is not a reliable warden. The philosophical framework is now complete. What follows is the literary evidence, the specific stories in which these propositions were first articulated, tested, and found to be as disturbing as their authors intended. The 7 entities did not arrive fully formed. They accumulated. Each emerged through a specific text, in a specific year, under specific creative conditions, and then grew through cross-reference, reinterpretation, and the gradual accumulation of detail across dozens of stories by multiple authors. Understanding how they first appeared and how those appearances connected to one another reveals the architecture of a mythology that was never planned, but somehow achieved the coherence of one that was. Nyarlathotep arrived first. In 1920, Lovecraft produced a short prose poem titled simply Nyarlathotep, written in a feverish burst directly after waking from a nightmare. The piece describes a figure, tall, swarthy, resembling an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, who arrives in a city and gives public demonstrations of strange electrical instruments. The demonstrations drive audiences to collective madness. The narrator follows Nyarlathotep through streets that dissolve into cosmic void. The prose poem is barely 1,000 words long. It contains no mythology, no cosmology, no outer gods, but it establishes 2 principles that would define the entity across everything that followed. Nyarlathotep communicates with humanity, and what it communicates is ruin. 7 years later, Lovecraft published The Color Out of Space in Amazing Stories, September 1927. The entity in this story has no name, no form, no mythology. It simply arrives on a meteorite and begins transforming its environment. Where Nyarlathotep was theatrical and personable, the color is impersonal and processual. Together, the 2 texts establish the poles of cosmic horror's entity spectrum, from the deliberately communicative to the utterly indifferent. The year 1928 brought Yog-Sothoth into the mythology through the Dunwich Horror, in which the entity fathers hybrid offspring with a human woman, Lavinia Whately. The story is atypical for Lovecraft. It has a relatively conventional monster hunt plot, but its cosmological references are foundational. Yog-Sothoth is described as the key and the gate existing outside our space-time, while simultaneously constituting its boundary. The Whately twins, one visibly monstrous, one passing as human, are the first textual evidence that Yog-Sothoth can interact with physical reality directly, producing biological consequences. This was a significant expansion. Prior to the Dunwich Horror, Lovecraft's cosmic entities were remote. After it, they could be proximate, present in human bloodlines, embedded in rural genealogies, hiding in plain sight. Frank Belknap Long published The Hounds of Tyndalos in Weird Tales in March 1929, and with it introduced the first major non-Lovecraft entity into the shared mythology. Long's innovation was geometrical rather than biological. Where Lovecraft's entities violated scale and category, the hounds violated the structure of time itself. The story's protagonist, Halpin Chalmers, achieves temporal regression through a rare Chinese drug called liao, perceives the angular predators that inhabit deep time, and spends his remaining hours trying to eliminate every acute angle from his apartment. Long had corresponded extensively with Lovecraft, and the two shared references freely. The hounds were immediately absorbed into the wider mythology, referenced by other authors, compatible with the Lovecraftian cosmos, yet possessing their own distinct flavor. Long's contribution proved that the mythology could grow beyond any single author's imagination without losing coherence. Azathoth's development followed a different path entirely. The entity never received a dedicated, completed story. Instead, it accreted, through fragmentary references across Lovecraft's later works. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath in 1927, The Whisperer in Darkness in 1931, the unfinished novel fragment Azathoth, begun around 1922, but abandoned after a single page. Each reference added a detail: the mindlessness, the nuclear chaos, the amorphous dancers, the thin, monotonous piping. By the time of Lovecraft's death in 1937, Azathoth had become the most powerful entity in his cosmos through pure accumulation. Never fully described, never directly confronted, always referenced from a distance that felt less like narrative choice and more like survival instinct. This accretive method would become the model for Daoloth, which Ramsey Campbell introduced in the 1960s through similarly scattered references across his Severn Valley fiction, and for SCP-3125, which QNTM built across multiple interconnected entries in the SCP Foundation wiki between 2015 and 2020. The intertext connections between these appearances are dense and deliberate. Lovecraft referenced Long's hounds in his own later fiction. Long referenced Lovecraft's Necronomicon. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, and August Derleth wove all of these entities into their own narratives, creating a web of cross-citation that mimicked genuine scholarly reference. A reader encountering the Dunwich Horror would find a mention of the Necronomicon. Reading another author's story, they would find the same text cited alongside new ones, De Vermis Mysteriis, the Book of Eibon. The effect was cumulative and persuasive, a body of fiction that felt like a body of research, complete with primary sources, conflicting interpretations, and gaps that invited further inquiry. The mythology's coherence was an emergent property of collaborative ambiguity rather than centralized design. No one planned it. Everyone contributed. And the result was a shared universe more convincing than any single author could have built alone, precisely because its inconsistencies felt like the natural disagreements between independent witnesses describing the same impossible events. Lovecraft called it his favorite. Critics have called it his best. And its central entity remains, nearly a century later, the most genuinely unfilmable monster in horror literature. The Color Out of Space, published in Amazing Stories in September 1927, deserves extended analysis not only because it contains one of our 7 entities, but because it demonstrates, more purely than any other single text, how cosmic horror achieves its effects through the systematic failure of every framework, scientific, linguistic, perceptual, that humans use to domesticate the unknown. The story's setting is deliberately mundane. A surveyor visits a rural area west of Arkham, Massachusetts, to map land that will soon be flooded for a new reservoir. He finds a blasted heath, a gray, dead expanse that the locals avoid. An old farmer named Ami Pierce tells him what happened. Insanities. The previous decade, a meteorite struck the Gardner farm. Scientists from Miskatonic University examined it and found anomalies they could not classify. The rock was soft, cooling impossibly fast, and contained a globule of color that matched nothing on the known spectrum. Their instruments registered it. Their categories could not contain it. The scientists left, puzzled, but not alarmed. This is the first mistake, and the narrative frames it as such. Not a failure of competence, but a failure of ontology. The scientists' categories were perfectly adequate for everything they had previously encountered. They were simply insufficient for this. The contamination proceeds with the slow inevitability of an ecological process. The Gardner orchard produces oversized fruit that tastes bitter and wrong. The vegetation grows in configurations that do not correspond to any terrestrial biology. Stalks twisting in ways that suggest intention without possessing it. Flowers blooming in colors that the narrative insists are impossible to convey. The animals follow. Insects behave erratically. Livestock becomes skittish and then deformed. The gardener's horses and cattle develop physical abnormalities that the local veterinarian cannot explain. Lovecraft layers these details with documentary patience. Each sentence adds one more deviation from the normal. No single deviation is dramatic enough to trigger alarm. The cumulative effect is devastating. The family's deterioration follows the same gradient. Nahum Gardner's wife, Nabby, is affected first, confined to an upper room, her speech becoming incoherent, her body beginning to change in ways the text declines to specify fully. The children follow. The youngest son, Merwin, simply vanishes. His mother screams from the attic, the only response. Thaddeus, another son, goes mad and eventually dies. Zenas disappears. Nahum himself is the last to fall. In his final conversation with Ami Pierce, he describes the color's presence with language that captures Lovecraft at his most effective. It come from some place where things ain't as they is here. One of them professors said so. The dialect is crucial. Nahum is uneducated, and his plain speech achieves something that the Miskatonic scientists' technical vocabulary could not, a direct, unmediated admission that the thing defies all categories, including the sophisticated ones. The story's climax is restrained in a way that amplifies its horror. Ami and a group of men visit the farm and discover Nahum's crumbling body, Mrs. Gardner reduced to something the text describes only as a disintegrating abomination, and the wellspring of the color itself, a pulsing luminescence rising from the well. The color departs in a column of light that shoots toward the sky, distorting the stars it passes. But And this is the detail that elevates the story above almost everything else in the tradition. Not all of it leaves. A faint glow remains at the bottom of the well. The reservoir will be built. The water supply of the region will be drawn from this spot. The contamination is not contained. It is about to be distributed. The surveyor, our narrator, ends by admitting that he is asked to have the reservoir's route altered and that he will never drink the water from it. He does not say he is safe. He says he will try to avoid the danger. The distinction is everything. What makes the color the purest expression of beyond reality among our 7 entities is its absolute resistance to classification. It is not alive in any biological sense, yet it metabolizes. It is not intelligent, yet it behaves with something resembling purpose. It is visible, yet it cannot be described. Every attempt to specify its appearance founders on the fact that it corresponds to no wavelength the human visual system can process. Lovecraft's narrative technique here is precise. He tells us what the color is not. Not any color known to Earth. Not any element on the periodic table. Not any phenomenon in the scientific literature. While refusing to tell us what it is, the negations accumulate until they become a shape. A negative space in the text where an entity should be but cannot be. Because the tools of textual representation are as inadequate as the tools of spectroscopic analysis. The color is the gap between reality and something else, and Lovecraft leaves the gap open. The story's final horror is ecological in a way that has only become more resonant with time. Written in 1927, decades before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, decades before the language of environmental contamination entered public consciousness, The Color Out of Space describes a process we now recognize. An alien substance enters an ecosystem, transforms it at the molecular level, moves through soil and water, and cannot be removed because it has become part of the environment itself. The color is not pollution. It is something far worse, something that redefines what the environment is. But the structural parallel is unmistakable. Lovecraft, working from pure philosophical anxiety about the alien and the unclassifiable, accidentally produced one of the earliest ecological horror narratives in the English language. The story endures because its horror was ahead of its time. The world has spent the intervening century catching up. If The Color Out of Space demonstrates cosmic horror's capacity for ecological dread, Through the Gates of the Silver Key demonstrates something arguably more disturbing: cosmic horror's capacity for identity dread. Co-written by Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price and published in 1934, the story follows Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's most persistent protagonist, as he passes through the ultimate gate and encounters the entity that governs it. That entity is Yog-Sothoth, or more precisely, an aspect of Yog-Sothoth known as Umur-at-Tawil, the most ancient one. What Carter finds on the other side of the Ababwi gate does not kill him. It does something worse. It explains him. The journey begins with Carter using a silver key, an artifact recovered in a previous story, to unlock a portal in a cave near Arkham. The passage moves him through increasingly alien environments until he stands before the ultimate gate, beyond which human identity cannot survive intact. Umur-at-Tawil offers Carter a choice: remain safely on this side of the gate, or pass through and learn the truth about the nature of the self. Carter, as scholars and occultists always do in these stories, chooses knowledge. He passes through. And the truth Yog-Sothoth reveals is this: Randolph Carter is not a person. He is a facet. His identity, his memories, his personality, His sense of being a discrete individual is a local projection of something infinitely larger. Every being across every dimension and every time is a partial expression of the same underlying reality, and that reality is Yog-Sothoth. The self is not an illusion exactly, but it is not what it appears to be. It is a temporary fold in a fabric that extends beyond comprehension. The philosophical resonances here are dense. The Buddhist concept of anatta, non-self, proposes that the individual self is a construction without ultimate reality. David Hume's bundle theory argues that what we call personal identity is merely a collection of perceptions with no underlying substance. Hindu philosophy's Atman-Brahman identity, the proposition that the individual soul and the universal soul are one, maps almost directly onto Carter's revelation. But Lovecraft strips these traditions of their soteriological comfort. In Buddhism, the realization of non-self leads to liberation. In Hinduism, recognizing one's identity with Brahman is the ultimate spiritual achievement. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, the realization leads to displacement. Carter's individual consciousness, unable to reintegrate after perceiving its true nature, becomes trapped in an alien body on an alien world, a creature called Skauba on the planet Yadith. He retains the memory of being Randolph Carter, but can no longer be Randolph Carter, because he now understands that Randolph Carter was never a complete entity. The knowledge does not liberate, it exiles. The story's narrative structure reinforces the horror through indirection. The account of Carter's experience is not told by Carter himself, but reconstructed by four acquaintances: a Creole occultist named Etienne Laurent de Marigny, Carter's cousin Ernest Aspinwall, the scholar Ward Phillips, and a mysterious Swami Chandraputra, who turns out to be Carter himself, inhabiting a human disguise through alien technology. The layers of mediation, a first-hand experience filtered through alien cognition, translated into a human disguise, reported to skeptical listeners, mirror the fundamental problem Yog-Sothoth embodies. Direct knowledge of the entity is impossible. Only refractions, approximations, and unreliable translations reach us. The truth is always one more layer removed than we can access. Our second text in this section operates on a different axis of dread. Frank Belknap Long's The Hounds of Tindalos, published in Weird Tales in March 1929, is concerned not with the dissolution of identity, but with the predatory nature of time itself. The story's protagonist, Halpin Chalmers, is a writer and occultist who has obtained a quantity of liao, a rare drug that enables consciousness to travel backward through time. Chalmers ingests the drug under the observation of his friend Frank, and his consciousness begins to regress, first through centuries, then through millennia, then through geological epochs, then beyond the emergence of life itself, into a primordial state where the distinction between matter and energy has not yet solidified. It is here, in the deepest reaches of pre-biological time, that Chalmers encounters the hounds. Long's description of the encounter is deliberately fragmented, presented through Chalmers' broken, fevered dictation to Frank. The hounds exist in the angles of time, a concept Long never fully explains, which is precisely why it works. Organic life, Chalmers reports, evolved along curves, smooth, flowing temporal paths. But before curves, there were angles, sharp, geometric, and inhabited. The hounds are lean, ancient, and hungry. They are aware of Chalmers. They have his scent, and they can follow him back. The remainder of the story follows Chalmers' increasingly desperate attempt to survive. He fills the angles of his apartment with plaster, rounding every corner where wall meets wall, where ceiling meets floor. He seals himself in a room that he has attempted to make entirely curved. It is not enough. The hounds enter through a corner he missed, the junction where ceiling meets wall, a 90-degree angle present in virtually every human-built structure. They leave behind a body drained of an unspecified vital quality and a residue of bluish, foul-smelling pus. The implications of Long's story extend far beyond its pulp magazine origins. The proposition that geometry can be hostile, that the angles of the rooms we inhabit are points of vulnerability to predators from outside of time, transforms every built environment into a potential hunting ground. The hounds do not wait in dark forests or ancient tombs. They wait in the corners of offices, bedrooms, and libraries. The architecture of everyday life is, within this mythology, an open invitation. Long also introduced a temporal dimension to cosmic horror that Lovecraft had only implied. Where Lovecraft's entities exist beyond space, the hounds exist beyond time, or rather, within a version of time that is older, more angular, and more dangerous than the version biological life evolved to inhabit. The drug Liao does not transport Chalmers to another place. It reveals that the place he has always occupied, the present moment, is not the safe, neutral medium he assumed. Time has depth, time has texture, and some of those textures are predatory. Together, these two texts illuminate the breadth of what beyond reality can mean in the cosmic horror tradition. Carter's encounter with Yog-Sothoth reveals that identity is a local illusion. Chalmers' encounter with the hounds reveals that time is a local arrangement. Both encounters produce irreversible damage, not because the entities are malevolent, but because the truths they embody are incompatible with the cognitive structures that make human life possible. The entities do not need to attack. The truth is sufficient. The mythology did not end with Lovecraft's death in March 1937. It could not. The architecture he and his correspondents had built was too open, too inviting, and too incomplete to remain static. What followed was a century of expansion, distortion, and reinvention that transformed a loose collection of shared references into one of the most persistent mythological systems in modern fiction. That transformation was not always faithful to Lovecraft's intent. In some cases, it actively contradicted it. But the tradition's vitality, its refusal to settle into a fixed canon, is itself the strongest evidence that its core premise retains power. August Derleth was the first and most controversial inheritor. As co-founder of Arkham House, the publishing imprint established in 1939 specifically to preserve Lovecraft's work, Derleth was arguably more responsible than any other individual for keeping cosmic horror in print during the decades when it might otherwise have disappeared into pulp magazine obscurity. His editorial contributions were invaluable. His creative contributions were something else. Derleth imposed upon Lovecraft's indifferent cosmos a moral framework borrowed from Christian theology, a war between benevolent elder gods and malevolent outer gods, with humanity caught between them. This was precisely the structure Lovecraft had spent his career rejecting. Lovecraft's cosmos had no sides, no moral axis, no war. It had only scale and the vertigo that scale produced. Derleth's additions, stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, The Trail of Cthulhu, and others published under Lovecraft's name as posthumous collaborations, reframed Azathoth and Nyarlathotep as agents of evil rather than embodiments of indifference. The debate over whether this constituted preservation or betrayal has continued for 80 years and remains unresolved. What is not debatable is the effect. Derleth's moralized version reached a wider audience than Lovecraft's amoral original, and many readers' first encounter with these entities was filtered through a framework their creator would have found philosophically intolerable. Ramsey Campbell began corresponding with Derleth in 1961 at the age of 15, and his earliest fiction drew heavily on Lovecraftian templates. But Campbell rapidly developed his own approach, darker, more psychological, and rooted in the specific landscape of England's Severn Valley rather than New England's Miskatonic Valley. His entity, Yog-Sothoth, emerged from this period, initially as a reference point in stories like The Render of the Veils, and later as a more fully developed presence in his expanding mythology. Campbell's innovation was to internalize the horror, where Lovecraft's characters encountered cosmic entities in remote locations, Antarctic mountains, deep-sea cities, rural backwaters. Campbell's characters encountered them in perception itself. Yog-Sothoth does not dwell in a distant dimension. It dwells at the edge of how we see, and its approach is signaled by the slow erosion of the perceptual filters that make ordinary experience possible. This psychological turn influenced virtually every subsequent author working in the tradition, from Thomas Ligotti to Laird Barron to John Langan. Thomas Ligotti deserves particular attention, not because he added entities to the mythology, but because he stripped the mythology down to its philosophical skeleton and argued that the skeleton was the point all along. In fiction collections like Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1986, and Grimscribe, 1991, and in the non-fiction work The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, Ligotti advanced a position that reframes every entity on our list. His argument, drawing on the pessimist philosophy of Peter Wessel Zapfe, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Philip Mainlander, is straightforward. Consciousness itself is the horror. Existence is not merely indifferent to human meaning. It is constituted by the absence of meaning. Entities like Azathoth are not speculative fictions. They are accurate descriptions of what already is. The blind idiot god at the center of infinity is not a metaphor. It is a diagnosis. Ligotti's influence on subsequent cosmic horror has been profound precisely because he closed the distance between the fiction and the philosophy, arguing that the monsters were never out there. They are descriptions of the conditions under which we already live. We simply prefer not to notice. The SCP Foundation, launched in 2007 on a wiki platform, represents the most radical structural innovation in the tradition since Lovecraft's original Circle. The Foundation is not an author or a publishing house. It is a system, a collaborative, open-access fiction project structured as the internal documentation of a secret organization. Thousands of contributors have written entries, and no single authority determines canon. The result is a mythology that is vaster, more contradictory, and more alive than anything Lovecraft could have imagined. SCP-3125, the mimetic behemoth created by the author QNTM between 2015 and 2020, is the Foundation's most Lovecraftian creation, an entity that exists beyond physical reality, in the dimension of ideas, and whose containment requires the systematic suppression of knowledge about its existence. The Anti-Memetics Division series that contains SCP-3125 runs across multiple entries and formats, following Foundation researcher Marion Wheeler as she struggles against an entity that erases awareness of itself. The series' conclusion is the most faithful execution of Lovecraftian philosophy in 21st century fiction. The Foundation loses. SCP-3125 consumes human coherence. Civilization does not collapse in fire or disaster. It simply stops thinking. The lights stay on. The buildings stand. But the minds inside them have been hollowed out by an idea too large for them to survive. What connects Derleth's moralizing, Campbell's psychologizing, Ligotti's philosophizing, and the SCP Foundation's systematizing is that each represents a different generation's attempt to answer the question Lovecraft posed, but never resolved. What are these entities, ultimately? Are they theological figures, psychological projections, philosophical arguments, information age threats? The tradition provides no final answer because the tradition's power depends on the question remaining open. Each expansion adds a new facet without closing the inquiry. The 7 entities on our list have been reinterpreted through moral, psychological, philosophical, and informational lenses, and none of these lenses has proven sufficient to contain them. They resist totalizing interpretation the way they resist, within their own narratives, physical containment. The mythology grows because it cannot be completed. The entities endure because they cannot be fully explained. And the tradition continues because each generation discovers, independently, that the questions it raises are not period artifacts, but permanent features of conscious existence confronting a universe that was not designed with consciousness in mind. The literary evidence is now assembled. What remains is the strangest chapter in this tradition's history, the chapter in which the fiction escaped its pages and began, behaving in measurable ways, like something other than fiction. Fiction, when it is sufficiently persuasive, does not stay inside its pages. It leaks. It generates belief, ritual, and occasionally violence. The 7 entities we have examined were created as literary devices, philosophical instruments designed to produce specific kinds of cognitive distress. None of their authors claimed they were real, yet across the decades since their creation, a persistent and measurable phenomenon has occurred. People have begun treating them as though they might be. The history of cosmic horror's escape from fiction into belief is not a footnote to the tradition. It is arguably its most disturbing chapter, because it suggests that the boundary between imagined and real is exactly as fragile as the stories themselves propose. The Necronomicon hoaxes are the earliest and most extensively documented case. By the early 1970s, decades of cross-referential citation by multiple authors had given Lovecraft's invented grimoire the textual density of a real historical document. Librarians reported patron requests. Booksellers received orders. In 1973, a small press edition attributed to L. Sprague de Camp appeared, offering a tongue-in-cheek scholarly treatment. In 1977, the Simon Necronomicon was published as a mass-market paperback by Avon Books, presenting itself as a genuine translation of a Sumerian magical text that Lovecraft had somehow learned about. It contained rituals, invocations, and entity names drawn from a pastiche of Mesopotamian mythology and Lovecraftian invention. It sold over 1 million copies. It remains in print. Practicing occultists, particularly within the chaos magic tradition that emerged in the late 1970s through the work of Peter Carroll and Ray Sherwin, adopted it as a functional ritual text, arguing that the efficacy of a magical system does not depend on its historical authenticity. If the rituals produce altered states and subjective results, the argument runs, then the question of whether the Necronomicon is real becomes philosophically irrelevant. The chaos magic position on Lovecraftian entities is worth examining in detail because it collapses a distinction that most people consider fundamental. Kenneth Grant, who led the Typhonian Order of the OTO from the 1950s until his death in 2011, published extensively on the convergence between Lovecraftian fiction and genuine occult tradition. In works like The Magical Revival, 1972, and Night Side of Eden, 1977, Grant argued that Lovecraft was an unconscious psychic channel, that his dreams and fictions accessed real metaphysical currents that he lacked the esoteric training to recognize as such. Yog-Sothoth, in Grant's framework, corresponds to genuine trans-dimensional forces mapped by earlier traditions under different names. Nyarlathotep corresponds to the trickster-initiator archetype found across shamanic and ceremonial magic systems. These are not casual claims made by fringe believers. They are systematic theological arguments published by an initiate of Aleister Crowley's own magical order. The tradition of treating Lovecraftian entities as real has institutional infrastructure. The Slender Man case provides a more recent and more disturbing parallel. In 2009, a user named Eric Knudsen created the Slender Man on the Something Awful internet forum as part of a Photoshop contest. The entity, tall, faceless, suited, tentacled, was explicitly fictional. Within months, collaborative fiction had expanded the mythology across multiple platforms. Within years, a measurable subculture had developed that treated Slender Man with genuine fear, reverence, or both. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, stabbed a classmate 19 times, later telling investigators they had done so to appease Slender Man and prevent him from harming their families. The mechanism is identical to the Lovecraftian process. Collaborative fiction, generated through shared contribution and cross-reference, achieves sufficient density and coherence to produce genuine belief and genuine action. The speed of the process, from forum post to violent crime in 5 years, suggests that the digital era has accelerated what the Lovecraft Circle's correspondence network took decades to produce. Reports of anomalous phenomena filtered through Lovecraftian language constitute a quieter but equally revealing pattern. The Hessdalen lights, unexplained luminous phenomena observed in a Norwegian valley since the 1980s, have been described by some observers using language drawn directly from The Color Out of Space. The Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, in which 9 hikers died under unexplained circumstances in the Ural Mountains, has been retroactively connected to Lovecraftian entities by online communities, despite having no historical relationship to the fiction. These connections are not evidence of the entity's reality. They are evidence of something arguably more significant. The fiction has provided a vocabulary. When people encounter phenomena that existing frameworks cannot explain, Lovecraft's language offers an alternative framework, one that names the unnameable, categorizes the uncategorizable, and provides a narrative structure for experiences that resist conventional narration. The fiction does not describe reality. It shapes the language through which certain realities are described. And language, as any philosopher of mind will confirm, is not a passive medium. It determines what can be thought. The question this raises is one that SCP-3125 makes almost unbearably literal. If an entity exists in idea space, if its substance is information rather than matter, then at what point does widespread belief in that entity constitute a form of existence? The chaos magicians argue that the point has already been passed. The skeptics argue that belief, however widespread, does not create metaphysical reality. The 7 entities on our list sit precisely on this fault line, and neither camp can claim definitive victory. What can be said with certainty is that these fictional constructs have generated real rituals, real belief systems, real institutional arguments, and at least one real act of violence. Whether that makes them real depends entirely on what we mean by the word. And as we have seen across the preceding 3 parts, the meaning of real is precisely what these entities were designed to destabilize. Translating entities that exist beyond reality into visual and interactive media presents a paradox that every adapter has confronted, and none has fully resolved. These beings are defined by their resistance to representation. The color has no earthly analog. Yog-Sothoth exceeds 3-dimensional perception. SCP-3125 cannot be perceived at all without fatal consequences. To show any of them is, at some level, to betray them, to reduce the unrepresentable to something a screen or a game engine can render. Yet the adaptations persist, and the best of them have found strategies for preserving the essential horror through indirection, structural innovation, and the strategic deployment of failure. Richard Stanley's 2019 film Color Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage, is the most successful direct adaptation of any text involving our 7 entities. Stanley's central challenge, depicting a color that does not exist, was solved through oversaturation, flooding the screen with a lurid magenta pink that registers as simultaneously beautiful and deeply wrong. The technique works not because the color looks alien, but because the film's visual grammar insists that it is alien, saturating every frame it touches until the audience's own perceptual comfort erodes. The Gardner family's deterioration is rendered with practical effects that emphasize biological wrongness over conventional gore. Stanley understood that the story's horror is processual, not eventful, and paced the film accordingly. The result is imperfect. Any visible color is, by definition, a compromise with Lovecraft's unrepresentable original, but it demonstrates that approximation can preserve dread when the approximation is handled with sufficient intelligence. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, is not an official Lovecraft adaptation, but it is arguably the most Lovecraftian film of the 21st century. The Shimmer, an expanding zone of biological mutation created by an alien signal, functions as a color analog, transforming everything within its boundary according to principles that human biology cannot accommodate. Garland's masterstroke is the film's climax, in which the protagonist confronts an entity that mimics her movements, her form, and eventually her appearance. The entity is not hostile, it is not comprehensible, it simply replicates, and the horror lies in the recognition that replication without purpose is, from the human perspective, indistinguishable from annihilation. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, takes a different approach entirely, centering not on an entity, but on the process of fiction becoming reality. A horror novelist's works begin manifesting physically, and the protagonist discovers that he himself may be a character in the novel he is investigating. The film is the most explicit cinematic treatment of the meta-horror that runs through the entire Lovecraftian tradition, the possibility that the stories are not describing something beyond reality, but summoning it. Video games have proven, in some respects, a more effective medium for cosmic horror than film, because games can make the audience participate in the cognitive collapse rather than merely observe it. From Software's Bloodborne, 2015, is the landmark achievement. The game begins as gothic horror. Werewolves, Victorian architecture, blood-soaked cobblestones, and gradually reveals, through a midpoint transformation that ranks among the most effective genre shifts in any narrative medium, that the true horror is cosmic. The Great Ones, vast, incomprehensible entities that have been manipulating the city of Yarnam from beyond human perception, become visible only after the player acquires sufficient insight, a game mechanic that literalizes the Lovecraftian principle that knowledge changes what you can perceive, and that what you perceive after gaining knowledge is worse. Remedy Entertainment's Control, 2019, transposes cosmic horror into bureaucratic architecture. The Oldest House, a brutalist skyscraper that is larger inside than outside and connects to dimensions governed by entities called the Board, whose communications arrive as overlapping, contradictory transmissions. The game's Federal Bureau of Control is, functionally, the SCP Foundation rendered playable, an institution dedicated to containing the incomprehensible through procedure, paperwork, and denial. The tabletop tradition deserves separate acknowledgement. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981 and continuously in print since, introduced the sanity mechanic, a numerical value that decreases with each encounter with the mythos and cannot be meaningfully restored. This single game mechanic has done more to codify Lovecraftian cognitive collapse than any academic analysis. Players do not merely read about minds breaking. They manage a resource that represents their character's mental coherence and watch it erode, encounter by encounter, with the certainty that zero is the only possible destination. Red Hook Studios' Darkest Dungeon, 2016, extended this principle by making stress a core system. Characters develop afflictions, refuse orders, sabotage their companions, and break down in ways that the player cannot fully control. The game does not simulate cosmic horror. It produces it by placing the player in the position of the doomed scholar, accumulating knowledge, taking risks, and discovering too late that the cost of progress is sanity. Music has engaged these entities more abstractly, but no less effectively. The Australian band Portal performs in robes and masks, producing a form of death metal so dense and dissonant that conventional musical analysis struggles to describe it, an approach that mirrors, in sonic terms, Lovecraft's linguistic strategy of describing entities through negation and failure. Blut aus Nord's The Work Which Transforms God, 2003, and Darkspace's trilogy of albums use layered, abyssal production to create the auditory equivalent of deep space emptiness. The connection to Azathoth's court, where amorphous dancers sway to thin, monotonous piping, is not coincidental. These musicians are attempting to produce sound that functions the way cosmic horror entities function, by overwhelming the listener's capacity to parse what they are hearing, producing disorientation rather than pleasure, vertigo rather than rhythm. Whether they succeed is, like all matters involving entities beyond reality, a question that resists definitive answer. In 2011, a book with a black cover and a dust cloud title appeared in academic philosophy sections of bookstores across the United States and Europe. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, the first volume of his Horror of Philosophy trilogy, argued that horror fiction, and cosmic horror in particular, constitutes a legitimate philosophical method for thinking about what Thacker called the world without us. The book proposed that Lovecraft, Legati, and their inheritors were not merely telling scary stories. They were doing philosophy by other means, using narrative to explore questions that systematic philosophy could formulate but not resolve. The book sold modestly in academic terms. Then the rapper Jay-Z was photographed wearing a jacket with its title printed on the back. Sales increased dramatically. The intersection of cosmic horror, academic philosophy, and popular culture had never been so visibly compressed into a single moment. Thacker's work belongs to a broader academic movement that has, over the past 2 decades, rehabilitated cosmic horror as serious intellectual subject matter. Graham Harman, a philosopher associated with object-oriented ontology, published Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy in 2012, arguing that Lovecraft's fiction captures something true about what Harman calls the withdrawal of objects from human access. In Harman's framework, all objects, not just Lovecraftian entities, have a reality that exceeds any perception or relation. We never encounter the totality of a chair, a stone, or another person. We encounter only the facets available to our specific mode of access. Lovecraft's contribution, Harman argues, is to dramatize this withdrawal at maximum intensity, to create entities whose inaccessibility is not merely a philosophical abstraction, but a felt experience transmitted through narrative. Yog-Sothoth is, in this reading, not a monster, but a philosophical demonstration. The thing in itself made narratively present through the very failure of narrative to contain it. The new weird literary movement, associated with writers like China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and K.J. Bishop, absorbed cosmic horror techniques into literary fiction during the early 2000s. Vandermeer's Annihilation, 2014, later adapted by Garland into the film discussed above, transplants Lovecraftian contamination into ecological literary fiction, complete with an entity called the Crawler that writes biological text on the walls of an underground tower using fungal growths. Miéville's The City and the City, 2009, creates an entity-free cosmic horror by positing 2 cities occupying the same physical space, whose inhabitants must deliberately unsee each other, a premise that literalizes the perceptual filtering that Dowloth threatens to remove. These works do not reference Lovecraft directly. They do not need to. The philosophical infrastructure he built has become ambient, a set of narrative tools available to any writer interested in the limits of perception and the fragility of consensus reality. The internet has produced its own distinct appropriation of the tradition. The SCP Foundation, discussed extensively in previous sections, is the most structurally innovative example, but it exists within a broader ecosystem of collaborative horror that includes creepypasta, analog horror, and unfiction. The Backrooms, a liminal space horror concept originating from a 2019 Forshawn post, describes an infinite empty office space that people can accidentally no-clip into from normal reality. It has no entities in its original form, only wrongness, the sense that a familiar environment, fluorescent-lit commercial carpet, damp yellow wallpaper, has been divorced from its context and extended into infinity. The Backrooms is cosmic horror stripped to its structural minimum. No gods, no cults, no forbidden texts, only the proposition that reality has an underside, and the underside is empty, humming, and vast. Analog horror series like Gemini Home Entertainment and the Mandela Catalog use the aesthetics of corrupted VHS tapes and emergency broadcast systems to suggest cosmic entities intruding into mundane media formats. The form implies the content. If your television can be infected, then the boundary between your living room and whatever lies beyond it is less solid than you assumed. Academic engagement with cosmic horror has also extended into psychology, cognitive science, and the study of existential risk. The concept of cosmic horror has been used in psychology papers discussing existential dread, death anxiety, and the phenomenon of overview effect, the cognitive shift reported by astronauts who see Earth from space, and experience a destabilizing sense of the planet's smallness and fragility. Researchers studying artificial intelligence risk have drawn parallels between Lovecraftian entities and hypothetical superintelligences, systems whose cognitive architecture is so different from our own that meaningful communication may be impossible, and whose goals may be as indifferent to human welfare as Azathoth is to the dancers at its court. Nick Bostrom's concept of the information hazard, discussed in Part 2, originates from the same philosophical neighborhood. The traffic between cosmic horror fiction and serious academic inquiry is no longer unidirectional. The fiction informs the scholarship. The scholarship deepens the fiction. The boundary between the two grows thinner with each passing year. What all of these appropriations share, from Thacker's philosophy to the SCP Foundation's wiki, from Bloodborne's game mechanics to Portal's unlistenable death metal, is a recognition that cosmic horror's core propositions are not genre conventions. They are descriptions of actual cognitive limitations dressed in narrative clothing. The proposition that human perception is a filter, not a window. The proposition that certain truths exceed the mind's capacity to contain them. The proposition that reality, as we experience it, is local, partial, and not guaranteed. These are not entertaining fictions. They are the anxieties of a species that has developed instruments, telescopes, particle accelerators, mathematical proofs, artificial intelligences, capable of revealing truths its biology was never designed to process. Cosmic horror endures because it is, increasingly, the genre best equipped to describe the situation we actually find ourselves in. We arrive, at last, at the question this entire analysis has been circling. Why do these 7 entities persist? They are fictional. Their authors said so. The traditions that spawned them are well documented, their literary debts traceable, their cultural contexts identifiable. Nothing about their creation is mysterious. And yet they endure, not as nostalgic relics of pulp horror, but as active presences in philosophy, art, game design, occult practice, and the private anxieties of people who encounter them and find, to their discomfort, that the encounter does not end when the story does. The persistence requires explanation. The explanation, as these entities would demand, is not comfortable. The simplest answer is that each entity embodies a genuine and unresolvable philosophical problem. Yog-Sothoth embodies the problem of ultimate reality, the question of what the universe is, at its deepest level, and whether that deepest level is accessible to human cognition. Azathoth embodies the problem of purposelessness, the possibility that the fundamental nature of existence is not merely indifferent to meaning, but constituted by the absence of meaning. Nyarlathotep embodies the problem of communication with the radically alien, the suspicion that if the universe did notice us, its attention would be worse than its indifference. To Chlorautiv, space embodies the problem of incommensurable experience, the existence of phenomena that fall entirely outside the categories human perception can process. The Hounds of Tindalos embody the problem of hostile time, the possibility that the temporal medium we inhabit is not neutral but structured, and that certain structures are predatory. Daoloth embodies the problem of total knowledge, the recognition that our perceptual limitations are not obstacles to understanding, but preconditions for sanity. SCP-3125 embodies the problem of dangerous ideas, the possibility that certain true thoughts are incompatible with the architecture of human consciousness. None of these problems has been resolved by philosophy, science, or theology. None of them can be. They are permanent features of the situation in which any conscious being finds itself. The contemporary relevance of these problems has, if anything, intensified since Lovecraft's era. We live in a period defined by encounters with scales, complexities, and phenomena that exceed intuitive human comprehension. Climate change operates on temporal and spatial scales that resist emotional engagement. A color out of space that transforms ecosystems according to principles most people cannot directly perceive. Artificial intelligence raises the prospect of minds fundamentally alien to our own, Nyarlathotep in silicon, communicating in patterns we can almost but not quite parse. The information economy has made SCP-3125's premise that ideas can be weapons, that exposure to certain information can damage cognitive function, less a speculative fiction than a description of measurable phenomena like radicalization pipelines, mimetic warfare, and the documented psychological effects of algorithmic content curation. Lovecraft wrote about entities beyond reality. We have built technologies that routinely confront us with realities beyond our cognitive equipment. There is a psychological dimension to this persistence that operates below the philosophical. Existential psychologists, drawing on the work of Irvin Yalom and Ernest Becker, have identified a set of ultimate concerns that all human beings must negotiate: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Cosmic horror maps onto these concerns with remarkable precision, but it does so by removing the coping mechanisms that ordinarily make them bearable. Religion addresses meaninglessness through divine purpose. Cosmic horror removes divine purpose. Community addresses isolation through connection. Cosmic horror reveals that connection is a local arrangement maintained by shared delusion. Narrative addresses death through legacy and continuity. Cosmic horror reveals that continuity is temporary and legacy is irrelevant on sufficient timescales. The entities persist because they strip the insulation from anxieties that most cultural forms exist to insulate. They present the ultimate concerns without mediation, and the mind that encounters them unmediated does not easily return to the mediated versions. Once you have seriously entertained the possibility that meaning is a local phenomenon in a meaningless cosmos, the ordinary sources of meaning, work, love, achievement, do not disappear, but they acquire a thinness, a translucency that was not there before. This brings us to what may be the most unsettling implication of the entire tradition, and it is an implication that Ligotti articulated most clearly, but that is present in Lovecraft from the very beginning. The seven entities are not metaphors, or rather, they are metaphors that point towards something that is itself not metaphorical. The blind idiot god at the center of infinity is a poetic image. The heat death of the universe is a scientific prediction. They describe the same thing. The perceptual filter that Daoloth removes is a narrative device. The filtering function of human attention and sensory processing is a documented neurological fact. They describe the same thing. The hostile idea entity that is SCP-3125 is a fiction. The measurable cognitive damage caused by exposure to extremist content, conspiracy frameworks, and algorithmically optimized outrage is a documented psychological phenomenon. They describe the same thing. The tradition persists because at each point where it seems most fantastical, it maps onto something empirically actual. The monsters are not real. The conditions they describe are. We said at the beginning that these entities exist beyond reality. We have now examined what that phrase means across a century of literary, philosophical, and cultural production. It means beyond the reach of human perceptual categories. beyond the scope of human temporal experience, beyond the capacity of human language to describe, beyond the ability of human consciousness to contain without damage. 7 entities, 7 boundaries, 7 demonstrations that the word reality describes not the totality of what exists, but the narrow band of what exists that our biology permits us to access. The scholarly impulse at this point is to conclude, to summarize, to synthesize, to offer a closing statement that ties the analysis into a satisfying whole. We will resist that impulse because the tradition we have been examining resists it, and to impose closure on material that is fundamentally about the impossibility of closure would be to betray both the subject and the audience. Instead, we will end where Lovecraft's narrators end, with the quiet admission that the analysis is incomplete, not because we have run out of material, but because the material exceeds the instrument. Something remains in the well, not all of it left, and the reservoir, as always, is being built.